Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the CCLA press conference at the offices of Hutchison. At this time, all microphones will be muted. Mesdames et messieurs, bonjour et bienvenue à la conférence de presse de l'Association canadienne des libertés civiles. We will now begin the press conference and start by hearing remarks from Noa Mendelsohn Aviv, Executive Director and General Counsel of the CCLA. Nous allons maintenant commencer notre point de presse et entendre une déclaration de la part de Noa Mendelsohn Aviv, Directrice générale et avocate générale de l'Association canadienne des libertés civiles. À vous la parole, Maître Mendelsohn Aviv.
Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. This week, the federal government invoked the Emergencies Act, an extreme law that has never been used, and it announced 2 emergency orders that will have sweeping consequences on individuals, orders that it passed outside of ordinary democratic processes. The Canadian Civil Liberties Association has spoken out loudly against this declaration, and today we have our own announcement. We are taking the Government of Canada to court. We are here today because of the government's response to the protests and blockades. The government's emergency declaration is unprecedented and seriously infringes the charter rights of Canadians. The government has brought in an extreme measure that should be reserved for national emergencies, a legal standard that has not been met. Emergency powers cannot and must not be normalized. For all the peaceful and disruptive protests in Canada's history, some involving unlawful acts and protracted standoffs with police, never before has a government declared a national emergency under the Emergencies Act, and with that given itself the enormous powers to bypass the ordinary, accountable democratic process. Our commitment to equality and other rights is the reason that we strongly support the charter right to peaceful assembly. This is how marginalized people can stand up for their rights. Protest is how people in a democracy express and share their political messages of all kinds, whether they be environmental activists, students taking to the streets, Indigenous land defenders, workers on strike, people who know that Black Lives Matter, and others who oppose government measures of all kinds. Our society needs peaceful assembly, a critical democratic tool. And even though not every person may agree with the content of every movement, many protests are disruptive. It is possible for a gathering to be both disruptive and peaceful and non-violent. Disruptive protest, while often unlawful, like shutting down pipelines or camping out in a public space, can be the most effective way of raising awareness. And at protests, many different kinds of people might end up in the same space, joined by a common cause. The fact that some of the protesters may break laws, act aggressively or oppressively, does not necessarily mean that other protesters share their extremist views or conduct. Let me be clear. We are deeply concerned by the reports that some of the protesters currently in the streets have engaged in violent, racist, and homophobic acts. We hear and recognize the impacts these acts are having on marginalized communities. We stand with these communities. We condemn this behavior. We also recognize that the recent protests are having a considerable and difficult impact on the lives of those who live and work in their vicinity. We recognize that people in Ottawa have been profoundly and negatively affected. But again, we are here today because of the government's response to these protests and blockades. The right to protest and peaceful assembly is not a free-for-all. Reasonable limits can and sometimes must be imposed. We have no issue with this. But when imposing reasonable limits, police can and must exercise restraint, as must government. Police must avoid escalation. We have fought many times against police shutting down protests using excessive force, detentions and arrests, in particular against Indigenous, racialized, and other marginalized protesters. I'd like to now turn it over to my colleague, Abby Deshman, who is the Director of the Criminal Justice Program.
Canadian Civil Liberties Association has retained counsel to launch a judicial review challenging the government's invocation of the Federal Emergencies Act. The Act gives the executive branch of the government extraordinary powers, and the legal threshold to use these extraordinary powers is intentionally high. Ensuring this threshold is met is a critical protection for the democratic process, the rule of law, and the civil liberties of individuals that may be impacted by these emergency orders. In our view, the threshold set out in the Emergencies Act, the legal requirements put in place to safeguard our democratic processes have not been met. Section 3 of the Emergencies Act requires that there be a national emergency, a temporary, urgent, and critical situation that seriously endangers the lives, health, or safety of Canadians and is of such proportions or nature that it exceeds the capacity or authority of a province to deal with it. It also encompasses serious situations that seriously threaten the ability of the Government of Canada to preserve the sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity of the country. In either case, the emergency must be such that it cannot be effectively dealt with under any other Canadian law. We do not want to minimize the impacts that the protests are having on people across the country. But while some of the blockades have been immensely disruptive, it is unclear that the ongoing protests endanger the lives, health, or safety of Canadians so seriously that they constitute a national emergency. It is also far from clear that our existing laws and police powers are ineffective in confronting this challenge. Police deal with extremely complex, difficult law enforcement situations every day. Local police across this country have cleared several highly disruptive border blockades and are successfully managing numerous other protests in communities across the country, all without emergency powers. There are some localized situations that have proven much more difficult to police. But the emergency orders that the government has passed are not targeted. They are not limited to specific protests or specific geographic locations. They are expansive emergency orders that apply equally across the entire country, and they place unprecedented restrictions on every single Canadian's constitutional rights. In other words, they apply to everyone, you, me, everyone. These emergency orders currently in force place severe limits on peaceful protest. Police have now been given the authority across the country to shut down a wide range of peaceful protests if they're snarling traffic or blocking sidewalks. Protests that take place close to bus stations, hospitals, or COVID-19 vaccination sites are specifically restricted, even if they aren't disrupting traffic. The order also requires financial institutions to turn over the personal financial details to CSIS and the RCMP, and to freeze the bank accounts and cut off all financial services of people who have attended or have provided assistance to those participating in a prohibited assembly. Again, these orders are not limited to Ottawa. They don't apply only at the border. They are not specifically targeting trucker convoys. These orders limit the rights of every single Canadian, with a particular focus on people who participate in, travel to, or assist with a protest, no matter where it takes place, no matter the issue. There are thousands of protests in Canada every year. Protests about climate change, Indigenous land claims, anti-Black racism, and yes, protests in support of and against public health measures. The vast majority of these protests are entirely peaceful. These orders potentially apply to them all. We believe that the federal government's invocation of these emergency powers is unlawful and unconstitutional. The Prime Minister has repeatedly said that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms continues to apply. We agree. And we believe that these measures are clearly unconstitutional. We will be asking the courts to step in to defend the rule of law and the constitutional rights of all people across the country. And I'll turn it over to Krajewska.
Good afternoon. Bon après-midi. Je m'appelle Krajewska. My name is Eva Krajewska, and I am counsel to the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. L'Association canadienne des libertés civiles commencera une demande de contrôle judiciaire. L'ACLC ne croit pas que le gouvernement a justifié son recours aux mesures d'urgence, notamment que les événements récents constituent une crise nationale qui crée une menace à la sécurité du Canada. We plan to file a notice of application for judicial review seeking a declaration that the emergency order and in the emergency order, the measures and the orders promulgated under it are not consistent with the Emergencies Act. This is the first time that a government has relied on the Emergencies Act. It is important from a rule of law perspective for the courts to scrutinize these actions and ensure that they are consistent with the purpose of the legislation and that the government does not overreach or infringe on the charter rights of Canadians. Thank you.
We'll now be taking questions from the media. Nous allons maintenant prendre des questions des médias. Veuillez s'il vous plaît signaler à la modératrice si vous désirez poser une question. Please signal the moderator if you'd like to ask a question.
Please press star 1 if you would like to ask a question. Once again, on the phone lines, please press star 1 on your keypad if you would like to ask a question. And at this time, it appears that we have no questions registered. On your first question, we do have one from Pamela Van Meer at 411 News. Please go ahead, Pamela.
Hi there. Thanks for taking my question. The Prime Minister has said that these measures would be geographical in nature, and you're saying that they're not, and it will impact every single Canadian. Can you expand on that a little bit and how they would impact every Canadian?
Yeah, the Prime Minister has certainly said that the measures would be targeted. The actual written text of these orders is not limited to specific cities. It's not limited to specific provinces. It applies across the entire country to every single Canadian. So they are not geographically limited. They do not target specific protests. They apply universally across the country.
I would add one note to that, if I may. They apply across the country, including those provinces whose premiers have said that they do not need the emergency powers under the Emergencies Act.
Okay, can I have a follow-up question?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So with regards to some of the things that have already taken place under this Emergencies Act invocation, such as bank accounts allegedly being frozen and that kind of thing, if you're successful, courts, would all of that be rolled back? Would these bank accounts have to be reinstated? What would happen at that point?
That's a good question, and this is a really unprecedented situation. This is a law that has never before been invoked. This is a legal challenge that has never before been initiated. I think a lot will depend on what the court decides, and the outcome of that ruling will have an impact on what has previously happened under these emergency orders, but it's too soon to tell what that might be.
Thank you.
Once again, ladies and gentlemen, if you would like to ask a question, please press star 1 on your telephone keypad. And at this time, we have a question from Alison Hannaford, New York Times. Please go ahead, Alison.
Hi, thank you very much for taking my question. The question I had actually was, this is the first time that they've had to use this Emergencies Act, and it's in defense of civil liberties of lots of people. So how would you go about, you were an everyday citizen who was being affected by protests, and it wasn't being enforced and it wasn't getting better. Would you sue for your own civil liberties for the same, would you go to you, for your law firm, to sue the people who are running the protest? for the sense of your own civil liberties of being able to like live freely in your city type thing?
I mean, we have seen lawsuits from the individuals who live in the neighborhoods trying to make sure that, for example, horns aren't blaring at all hours of the day. You know, there are legal remedies available to people who are being impacted by these protests. We've also seen businesses go to the courts to ask for injunctions to clear roadways so that their interests are protected. Those are all completely normal legal mechanisms, right? They already exist in our law. The police have numerous powers that they use every day to police protests, very difficult protests across this country. Those are the normal court processes and powers that we should be relying on to address the situation.
Follow-up question?
Sure.
No follow-up question, thank you.
Thank you. Once again, as a reminder, ladies and gentlemen, you will need to press *1 on your telephone keypad if you have a question. And next, we have a question from Mike Blanchfield at Canadian Press. Please go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for doing this. During the debate in the House of Commons today, a point was made by supporters of the Act, and if I heard the NDP here say this correctly, that people organizing this protest want to overthrow the government, have said so publicly on their website. So does that give any justifications in invoking this, act as it should be done early in your view?
Yeah, I think the legal test in the Act itself is quite clear. It doesn't speak to the content of the speech that people might be saying online or otherwise. Frequently, there are very extreme views that are expressed online and in protests. That is not unusual, and that in and of itself does not justify the invocation of the Emergencies Act.
I'd like to make another comment about the legal test and the legal necessity. The government tabled before Parliament its statement and its materials explaining why it believed that it could invoke the Emergencies Act. And the kinds of things that it referred to were the Canadian economy, international trade, and stopping the protests and the disruption for families. These are the statements that we've heard in the media by the government. This is what was in their original declaration of emergency, and it was what was presented again today. If you wanted to stretch the Emergencies Act and make it a normal power that governments could bypass democratic processes, something that we strongly oppose, then you could argue that any kind of protest at any time, anywhere, and many other activities constitute a national emergency. Every time police have to deal with organized crime or a difficult law enforcement situation, that too threatens the lives and safety of Canadians. But the Emergencies Act is clear. It has to be a very serious danger to the life, health, and safety of Canadians. That is completely overwhelming to the provinces, or it has to be a serious threat to the territorial integrity, security, or sovereignty of Canada that Canada does not already have laws to address. That is what we mean by the rule of law. We want democratic laws to address difficult situations, not emergency powers that should not be normalized for situations that can be dealt under democratically created laws.
Do you have a follow-up, Mike?
Yeah, sure, why not? I mean, okay, I totally see what you're saying, but just like devil's advocate, I mean, you see fire pits outside the Prime Minister's office and barbecues and hot tubs. There's a complete lawless breakdown of law and order in the capital, at the center of national power in this government. So, that does impact our trade, it impacts the economy, businesses are shut. So just again, playing devil's advocate, can you talk to that? I mean, why not? Why not invoke it? Taking your point that it is obviously a very serious step.
It is certainly not normal to have those things happening in front of Parliament, right? It certainly violates, I'm sure, many laws to do that kinds of activities in the streets. But there are lots of protests that have similarly been incredibly disruptive, unlawful, and violent. You think of the protests that happened in Quebec, the Printemps Arabe, where there were thousands and thousands of students flooding the streets of that province for months on end, including property damage, including confrontations with the police. We can think of the G20 protests in Toronto, where police cars were burned downtown. It is not unprecedented for protests to also include very concerning acts of property damage and violence. That sometimes happens during a protest. That in and of itself does not mean that the Emergencies Act is the appropriate response. In fact, to date, throughout the past 30 years, Canadian police have successfully dealt with a very wide range of protests without resort to emergency legislation.
Thank you. If there are no further questions, this concludes the press conference. S'il n'y a pas de questions supplémentaires, ceci conclut la conférence de presse. The CCLA will be circulating a press release to members of the media shortly. La CALC diffusera son communiqué de presse très prochainement. Thank you for joining us. Merci de votre participation cet après-midi.